Yeah, they're not. I think it might go ahead. I think you should sit there. Oh, you'll be on by yourself. Alright. More shot? Yeah. 5 seconds.
Okay, I just saw Kimberly walk out. I didn't know if you wanted to wait for her to come back. We should just wait. I don't know where she's going. So Blake, I guess whenever you're ready. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the speaker series. So Scott asked me to give a talk, and I said, no, I don't think so. And he insisted, and I said, well, okay, we have an opening in October for the speaker series, and so I thought I would just jump in here. So today I'm going to give a talk on some stuff we've been working on that I think is kind of creative. That I thought the group might be interested in hearing. So this is something I've been working on for a little over a year now, and sort of come together with a whole series of results. So no, there won't be any introduction. I know some of you were asking, but that's all there is. You all know me, and I know you. So we're just going to go from there. So let's see. Okay. Yeah. So this is the sort of truth in advertising slide of what I'm going to talk about today. And of course, I know I'm keeping you all from a celebration on the rooftop, so I will try to keep this under 90 minutes, so we don't miss too much celebration time. So these are the 6 things I'm going to cover today. I want to begin with a very brief background on the sort of the history of types of people. Galen, the medical doctor from ancient Greece, suspected that there were different kinds of people based on different bodily fluids. Like they had too much of one bodily fluid or another, and that would impact their personality. Sort of the early origins of biological approaches to personality, but it was also one of the first approaches, or at least that we know of, to personality that referred to people as having different types. Of course, we're all very familiar, pretty much everybody's familiar with the Myers-Briggs types. But in the 1990s, personality psychologists were doing a significant amount of research on types. In fact, there was a big conference among personality psychologists that was dedicated entirely to types. And everybody's very excited that this is going to be the future of personality psychology. We've got all this rich data now. We're going to talk about types. And the opening speaker at that conference gave a talk, the most comprehensive talk, the best data ever on types, in which he concluded that this is completely pointless. We would be better off with traits, and types are going nowhere. And that's how they kicked off the conference on types. So you can imagine that it wasn't that great of a conference. But recently, some folks have been doing some work on types. There was a paper in Nature about a year and a half ago, looking at common personality types, and suggesting that there might be something there now that we have sort of bigger data and better techniques than we did in the 90s. So there may be some new enthusiasm for it. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is one approach or one way we can think about person types, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to point out a few things, some of the advantages of person types, or thinking about people in terms of types. Of course, we usually think about them in terms of the Hogan dimensions, but there are some nice advantages to types. So one advantage of types is that it gives you information about somebody very quickly. If you say that person's a compulsive type, right, or an anal type or something like that, you have an idea of what that person's like. Oh, that one's a party type or something like that. It gives you some sense of what that person is like really quickly. And that's a nice advantage of types. The other thing about types is they tend to refer to whole persons more. When we think about people as types, we're not talking about one trait at a time. We're not talking about adjustment. Or I'm not talking about excitability or something like that. I'm just talking about the entire person as a whole thing, which, if you're thinking about personality, that's kind of what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about whole people, not about traits in some sort of metaphysical space. The other thing that's useful about types is that they can be, I think, useful for coaching and development, and that's in fact where this all started. I was in a certification workshop, and one of the pieces of feedback that I was hearing from people was that, okay, I've learned about all of the Hogan scales, and I've given feedback to one person, and now I have to go give feedback to lots of people, but I don't really feel prepared. And I started thinking, well, they've learned about all these scales. If you look at a flash report, that there's got to be common patterns that show up, right? Oh, I've seen a flash report like this before, right? So many of you have seen lots of flash reports, so presumably this is an experience you've had. And I started thinking, there's probably some common set, some kind. In fact, the workshop has a couple of example, right? Here's a profile, practice interpreting this one. Here's a profile, practice interpreting this one. I started thinking, there's probably some common ones. And if we could teach people to practice those common types, maybe that would be a really useful way for them to get started in terms of coaching and doing developmental feedback. I'm not going to spend much time on this, so this is a version of a talk I gave in London a few weeks ago, but you are all familiar with our data. They weren't, so I had to explain a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk to you about what the HPI is. You know these. I'm not going to talk to you about what the HDS is because you know these, and I'm not going to talk to you about what the MVPI is. Okay. But I will mention a couple of things. The sample, oh, by the way, I also know that maybe none of you have ever seen me speak before, I think. Yeah, so one of the things about my talks that's different from RT's talks is RT's talks are his talks are like getting into a boxing match and somebody just throwing haymaker after haymaker, right? My talks are more like I'm going to wear you down with slide after slide of data and graphs and more data, and it's more like lots of little jabs, right? And so there's going to be a lot of data. When you come to my talks, you can guarantee there's going to be a lot of data. So this is the data set that we're working with for today. And just a little bit more breakdown. This is pretty common, what we see in our data, right? This is the kind of data that you all collect when you have clients who do research. This is kind of what it looks like, where the job families come from and what job levels we're at. I also won't talk much about this because it's really boring, but there actually were a whole host of sophisticated steps we had to take to do these analyses. So one of the things that we have to do is, as you all know, our scales have different numbers of items, many of them do, right? And so how do you compare a score on adjustment to a score on excitable? Well, one way to do it is to use percentiles. There's some technical problems with using percentiles for these kinds of analyses. So what we do is we convert them to what are called POMP scores, or percentage of maximum possible. So if there's 14 items on a scale, it's the number that you marked true out of 14, and so on. So everything's scaled out of 0 to 1. So everything's the same scale. Okay, and then I did a bunch of fancy cluster analyses that I think they're cool and fun, but they're actually really boring for most people. But essentially, what this ultimately ends up with is what I've done is taken scores on our assessments, 28 scales, right? So no subscale stuff. This is adjustment all the way through tradition, or science if you do it that way. On our 3 core measures, HPI, HTS, and EPI, and you just say, what are the most common profiles that show up? That's the simple way of talking about this analysis. And ultimately, what I identified was 8 that show up all the time. I'm 100% confident that these replicate across different samples, and I actually cut our data down into small subsamples to check to see if they replicate. I'm pretty sure there's probably more than 8 common profiles, but I can guarantee you with 100% certainty these 8 profiles show up in multiple samples. So these are the most common profiles that we see in our data set. And now I'm going to show you what those are. But I want to mention real quickly, most people fit these actually pretty well. So you can calculate how close do people fit a profile. So I can just take that full sample of 300-some thousand people and say, how close are you to fitting one of these 8 profiles? And most people fit them really, really well. Only about 5% don't have a very close fit to one of the profiles. Okay, so about 95% of people fit one of the profiles pretty well. Okay, this is where it gets fun, because these are the actual profiles. So our team made me give them labels. For a long time, I called them Profile 1, Profile 2, Profile 3, and I kind of liked that, but it was really hard to talk to other people about it because they didn't know what I was talking about. And so now they all have labels with some help. Some friends, Tori helped with one of the labels. One of the labels still needs some more help, but we'll talk about that shortly. So across the x-axis, everything is in the order. Sorry? Okay. So across the x-axis, everything is in the order of the scales that we're most familiar with, right? So this is the HPI 7, and then the HDS 11, and then the MVPI 10. And so if you're like trying to figure out which ones are which, you just have to remember the order. It's just the same as on a flash report. So it's good for you all. Hard for other people, but good for you all because you know what the order is in these. And so up here is the percentage of people who fit that profile, so about 8% fit this one. And I wrote this, so after I got these 8 profiles out, I wrote a really brief description. Like, I saw no other data, all I saw was this profile, and I said, okay, this is kind of what this is about. And I just wrote that down, okay? And so I would revise those now that I've seen more stuff, but I would, in the interest of integrity, I just left them, right? So I said, okay, this is what I said when I first saw them. Okay, so yeah, this profile is characterized, as you the high excitable score, high skeptical score. We also see high recognition, high power score, high sociability, and then high in the sort of openness to experience cluster there with inquisitive and learning approach, low adjustment. Those are probably the most prominent features on this one. And with some help from research and marketing folks, we tried to identify people from popular media who might, or characters from popular media who might fit these profiles. And so here are a few. There are, of course, many, many more, but here are a few that we might consider to be rebels based on their characters in their respective shows. Just for fun, RT, I went ahead and ran his profile, and he fits this one. About 18% of people fit the profile, the second profile, which is I call marketers. This one, we see a really highly elevated HPI, except a little bit lower on prudence, closer to the midpoint on prudence. And then we see some elevation on the HDS in these sort of moving against cluster. And so this is what I said about this group, that they're competitive, they want to win, but they're certainly not short on confidence. And here are a few people who might fit that profile. They're sort of very upbeat and optimistic about things. By the way, I think most politicians actually fit this profile too. The next one, and this is one that needs help with the name. I refer to this one as proletarians. What's interesting about this one is that this group is pretty much average on the HPI. They're right around the 50th percentile and everything. We see a pretty flat MVPI profile. And when I first showed this to people, some consultants told me, this is crazy, nobody ever actually has this one. And then I started actually pulling data. I said, well, let me go look, let me just go see. And it turns out actually a lot of people do have MVPI profiles like that. Maybe you don't run across them very often, but in fact, it's true. There's a fair number of people who have MVPI profiles that look like that. This group is mostly interested in stability and a simplistic lifestyle. That's was my interpretation. That they just want to work and go home and not have anybody bother them. This group isn't trying to climb the corporate ladder. They just want to have normal jobs and be with their families and live quote unquote normal life. I introduced this in London and everyone laughed really hard because people in Europe are really well educated, and so they knew what the word proletarian meant, and they thought, wow, that's really insulting. Equivalent words would be things like plebeian, peasant, commoner. So we really could use a better term here. If you've got one, let me know. All right. So here's the people that would fit the proletarian profile. I particularly think Ron Swanson's a really good fit for that profile if you're familiar with Parks and Rec. The fourth one is congenials. Congenials, these people are really, I think the things that really stand out are the high adjustment and the high interpersonal sensitivity, right? So these people are really about getting along, they're really emotionally stable. They have a very, the MBPI profile, everything is below average on the MBPI, which I think is, again, this is another one. So if nobody has an MBPI profile, it turns out we do. We have people in our database all the time who have MBPI profiles like that. I don't know what you all do when you interpret those, but it's basically people who don't have any particularly strong career or motivational interests. They mostly are motivated to get along with other people in whatever way, it seems like. And so that's what I said. These people are polite and friendly. And some people who might fit this profile look like this. Right? People who want you to like them. The fifth profile I refer to as overachievers. These people, the things that mark really high on them is the high adjustment, high ambition score. Also their HDS is pretty low across the board except for dutiful and diligent. Right? So these people are rule followers. These people want to have successful careers. What's really interesting about this one psychologically is that they insist on playing by the rules. Right? They want to get ahead, they want to compete, but they absolutely will not cheat to do so. Right? They have this sort of like a Girl Scout or Boy Scout mentality. And some of the characters that I think fit this one include these folks. It's interesting, Parks and Rec really has a lot of characters that fit these profiles really nicely. Actually, when I was looking for photos of Leslie Knope, there was one that said, whatever you do in life, do it like Leslie Knope. Which is sort of like, that's like the quintessential sort of overachiever kind of thing. Networkers, this is the sixth profile. This one's also really interesting because, so we see this high sociability score. We also see the high moving against part, particularly bold, imaginative. And we see this low security score, the low prudent score, low diligent, low dutiful, right? So not rule following, but really good at socializing. And wanting to climb the corporate ladder via that route. So if we can compare this one to the previous one, right? The overachievers want to get ahead, and they insist on playing by the rules. This group doesn't care about the rules at all. This group says, I'm going to get ahead, and I'll cheat, I'll do whatever, I'm going to rub elbows with whoever I need to. Whereas the previous group thinks, if you just work hard every day, people will notice your accomplishments, and you'll just rise to the top. This group thinks, nah, forget all that. I just work my way to the top by talking to the right people and making the right friends. And so here's some folks that might fit that profile. Again, I think the Parks and Rec ones are really quite good. Tom Haverford's pretty much a quintessential networker. The seventh profile we refer to as misfits. So this one, we see a pretty low across the board on the HPI, more mid-range with the openness scale, but otherwise pretty low across the board. High on the moving away part of the HDS. A really pretty low score on altruism. I'm sorry, not altruism, but affiliation rather. And so I said this group is mostly motivated by fear. They've got a little bit of a spike on security, and of course the high score on cautious as well. They have difficulty dealing with emotions and tend to be rather reclusive from a social standpoint. Not a whole lot of people fit this profile. Here might be some examples. And then the last group is not that dissimilar from the misfits. This one we refer to as preppers. This was with a lot of discussion to try to come up with a name on this one. This group is similar in a lot of ways. The difference is, so much like group 7, they're sort of motivated by fear, and they're both pretty introverted. But the difference here, I don't know if anybody can tell. Can you see which is the biggest difference? It's hard when I do it this way. I think your eyes tend to want to go here, but it's actually right here. It's actually this score on Cruise. It's the one that's the biggest difference between profile 7, the misfits, and profile 8, the preppers. So essentially what we have here with preppers is motivated by fear and using that fear to be more organized, to be more diligent, to be more rule following, to not be rejected from the group. Whereas the misfits kind of don't care about being rejected from the group. The preppers are really worried about that. Right? And we say preppers, not necessarily meaning that they're doomsday preppers, but that they are always prepared for the worst that can happen. And so here are some of the characters that we think fit that. I really think Rex from Toy Story fits it really well. It's sort of like always ready to panic at any moment and trying to be over-prepared so that nothing bad happens. So we didn't stop there. That's where I initially started, and I know some of you participated in this. I asked some consultants to provide their descriptions of these profiles, and so with John Joyce's help, I sent flash reports to consultants, and 8 of you did so. There's a total of 82 years of experience, and then you wrote interpretations, and to make those interpretations easier to see, I put them into word clouds. So I just created word clouds, and with Nathan's help, I actually got to make really fancy looking word clouds. And so here's one for the rebels. So things we see that stand out: volatile, emotions, direct, emotionally, those passionate, energetic. Those are the kinds of things that show up for the rebels. For the marketers, this is my favorite, because when I first saw it, I thought, wow, this group is really confident. And the first word that comes out when the consultants are is confident. But also convince, right? Which is sort of like persuading, good at charming other people, that kind of thing. Oh, also, right, the confidence is twin, arrogant. It's also there. For the proletarians, it's kind of a mixed bag. And I think this is because it's actually, as we all know, it's one of the most difficult profiles to interpret. What do you do when somebody's just kind of average on everything, right? It's harder to interpret, and that's what I think we kind of see here. For the congenials, and some of the words are hard to see on this one, but social, nice, right? So I think that's about what we would have expected there. Modest shows up. For overachievers, my favorite is the one that showed up the most from all the consultants was the phrase high standards. And this is like exactly what we think with overachievers. Perfectionistic. For networkers, we see risk, we see manipulative, we see somewhat unpredictable, we see some sort of like outgoing and sociable, interacting with others socially. I don't think that one's on there. For the misfits, again, it's interesting because the consultants, I think you guys are so well trained that you don't want to say anything that might be considered not positive. And so you don't see a ton of that on here. But it says things like vigilant, mistrusting, things like that. And then for preppers, I think, again, the one that's really obvious is predictability, right, which is really what preppers want. They want that stability and predictability in what's going on. Okay, so as I promised, there would be lots of more data, and there is. So one of the questions we might want to ask is, okay, you fit me to this profile. If I took the assessment again, would I get the same profile, or would I get something different? And so we actually have about 2,000 some people who've taken our assessments more than once. And so I can fit them to the profile at time 1, and fit them again to a profile at time 2. The average interval between assessments for these individuals is about 270 days. Some people took it 1 day apart. Some people took it over 1,500 days apart. And what's the upshot here? Is about half of the time you get the same profile. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's not very good. I only get the same profile half the time. But just keep in mind, there's 8 profiles, right? So if everything was random, it would be 1 out of 8. It actually turns out, mathematically, that's not quite the base rate. The base rate's actually 14.3%, and I won't get into technical details about why. But the point is, it's way more, way better than random. That is, the stability of the profiles is way better than random. They're actually pretty stable. And this graph kind of shows that as well. So how do people change? Actually, on average, people don't. And so what's going on in this graph is green means, so profile 1 is Rebel's profile, this is profile 2, this is profile 3, right, all the way around. Green arrows mean a positive relationship between the two at time 1 to time 2, okay? So for number 2, for example, if I was a marketer at time 1, there's a high chance I was a marketer at time 2 because there's a green arrow going back to marketer, right? Red arrows mean less likely, right? So if I was a proletarian at time 1, I'm less likely to be a marketer at time 2, right? I'm unlikely to be a marketer at time 2. Right, and what we really see is that it's green, loops back to itself. Right, so that is, what that tells us is that mostly people don't change. Mostly people keep the same profile when they take it again. Now, some people do change, right? They're not all green. There's some other things out there. So then we might ask ourselves, if we change, what way do we change? So people who change from time 1 to time 2, how do they change? This is a graph that shows that. And the thing that's really clear is the connection between 2 and 5, the connection between 6 and 2, the connection between 5 and 3. Right? Darker, greener lines mean a stronger relationship between those. So the point here is that people, when they change from time 1 to time 2, it's things like 2s go to 5s, 5 goes to 2s. Now I think there's important implications there from a development standpoint, but I also think we can just sort of investigate empirically why that would be. And it turns out that if we just look at how similar the profiles are to each other, just like those profiles that I showed before, they're not mathematically independent. They're not like Myers-Briggs types where you say you're either this type or you're that type. They're correlated with each other. This graph shows the correlations between the types, and this graph shows how do people change. So the point here is when people change, they change to one that's really similar to what they were. Right? 2 and 5 aren't that dissimilar. So people sometimes flip, especially if you were close at time 1, you might flip to the other one at time 2, which is not really that surprising. So big picture, mostly people don't change. When they do change, they change to one that's a highly similar profile. So people aren't dramatically shifting from profiles that are very different, which is probably no news to us because we already know the assessments are reliable and they're pretty stable. So, but anyway, it's kind of nice to investigate. Okay, so now let's talk about validity data. I have 5 different ways that I've worked to validate these profiles, to say, do these things actually correlate with, predict something that's actually interesting. And this is where I think it gets really fun. One of the things I looked at is job, family, level, and representativeness, right? So how representative is this profile in a particular job family or at a particular job level? Okay, and so I'm going to put up a chart here that's going to seem a bit overwhelming, but I'm going to point you to the important pieces. So on the left-hand side, we have the profiles. And across the top, we have our job families. Blue, the bigger positive numbers, means that you're overrepresented. So what we can do is we can actually figure out this whole grid. How many people, based on the base rates of how many people are in each one, based on the base rates of our job families, we can say this is how many people we would expect to be in each box. And then we can compute how many people are actually in each box. And then we can just simply compute the percentage of the difference. Right? How big of a percentage change it is. And that's what these numbers are. So, marketers overrepresented in sales. 10% too many marketers in sales. Kind of makes sense, right? Marketers highly confident, they're good at persuading. Remember, we go to the consultants' terms, they said things like convince, right? So they're overrepresented there. Misfits and preppers both overrepresented in the military. We see rebels are actually overrepresented among students, which is, I think, kind of interesting as well. Congenials overrepresented in admin and clerical. So there's a bunch of, I think, interesting patterns that we can see in terms of how our personalities relate to the jobs that we work in. We can do the same thing with job level. What I thought's fascinating about this is when I wrote the description for overachievers, I said, these people have a lot of leadership potential. And they're not in leadership roles. In fact, they're overrepresented in individual contributor roles. Who is overrepresented in leadership roles? Networkers. I think that's really fascinating. All right. It speaks to some of the stuff we talk about when we talk about leadership effectiveness versus thank you. Right. Leadership. This is a great audience. Versus leadership emergence. Right. And so what we see here is this group really has those characteristics that we think of as associated with leadership emergence, and it works out well for them. This group keeps thinking, if I just keep working hard, someday somebody's going to notice, and they're going to promote me. And then they're not. Other things we can do, we can score all of these profiles, people who fit the profiles, we can score them on things like general employability. So which of these profiles is most employable, which is least employable? And of course you're familiar with our model, so I won't walk you through our employability model. But these are just standardized general employability scores for each of the 8 profiles. And so what we see is rebels score low on people skills, okay on learning skills, and low on work ethic. And so their general employability slightly below average. Farther below average misfits and preppers, they both are the same in terms of their overall level, but for different reasons. Misfits, it's mostly about a lack of people skills. For preppers, it's more about learning skills. Right, and of course the overachievers, they score the highest on general employability, followed by the marketers. Other things we can look at, we have some really interesting samples at Hogan, and we can say, well, how are these profiles represented in these samples? So we have a sample of entrepreneurs. We have, thanks to some friends in Europe, some members of organized crime gangs, and we have lots of data on intern workers. And so we'll just compare these 3 samples. So among our entrepreneurs, we see this pattern. Too many rebels. 13.6% too many rebels. I think rebels is around 18%. So rebels is around 8% in the general population, and we see something like 24% or 23% in the entrepreneurial sample. We also see a lot of networkers. So rebels and networkers more likely to be entrepreneurs. Congenials and overachievers not likely to be entrepreneurs. Which again, I think is really fast, right? These is much more rule following, much more rule breaking. Right. Members of organized crime. Isn't that cool? The rebels, heavily overrepresented. Right? Now think about that. They're overrepresented by entrepreneurs and in organized crime gangs. It's actually interesting. So when I was looking up some research around this, there's an economist who has a theory that there is a fixed number of entrepreneurs in a population. Give me a population of people, there is some percentage who will be entrepreneurs. And the the rate of crime in that population of people will be directly related to the amount of rules you have. That is, these people will break the rules. The stronger your rules are, the more criminals you will have. which I think is just directly related to this, right? So these rebels have this entrepreneurial spirit to them. I think actually what's going on is the ones that are well educated become entrepreneurs, and the ones who don't have as much of an educational background become criminals, which bigger social issues on that. We have a data set of in-church workers. They're overrepresented by misfits and preppers, in part because the misfits profile probably, well, as you saw, both of those scored low on general employability, right? So, sorry, if you're not familiar with MTurk, sorry. MTurk is what we sometimes use in research to test items. So these are people who basically take surveys all day long for a living. It's not a great living. We pay nicely, but other people don't. Other people who are on tighter budgets might pay. I mean, I've seen things go for 50 cents an hour, things like that. They say, well, it's taking you an hour to take, but we'll give you 50 cents to do it, and people do it, right? So this is a unique group of people, and we see that it's uniquely related to person profiles. Then we get to performance data. So this is where it gets even more fun, because I'm assuming some of you have been thinking about which one you fit along the way here. So maybe we should take votes. Who thinks they're, maybe not. So this is from our performance archive, and I'm going to start with overall performance. And these are cat's eye plots. So the dot is the mean. The distribution just gives you a sense of where people tend to fall around that mean. And these are confidence intervals around that. So what do we see? Rebels slightly below average. These two kind of around average. The congenials, overachievers, and networkers all above average. Misfits well below average, and preppers right at average. And I think this is really interesting for a lot of reasons. One, remember, misfits and preppers, their profiles aren't that different. The one big difference is that prudence. Is this group has a prudence around the 50th percentile. This group has it like the 20th. Right? And look at the difference in their performance ratings, overall performance ratings. So again, I think there's really important implications from a coaching standpoint. If I'm talking with somebody who's a misfit and having trouble at work, things to work on, I mean, if I can get that prudence to go up just a little bit, right, it can have pretty big implications for that person's success at work. Other interesting things I think about this one, I thought the overachievers would get the highest ratings. They didn't. The congenials did. Why? Why did the congenials get the highest ratings? Highest performance ratings?
Because they're people pleasers?
Exactly. I was so stupid. I should have thought of that. Like after I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. These are all done by managers, right? Almost always it's a supervisor rating. Who do supervisors like? People who don't cause them problems, right? Who don't cause a lot of trouble, right? People who are high in adjustment, and people who are easy to get along with. People who are high in interpersonal sensitivity. That's what the congenials are. High adjustment, high interpersonal sensitivity. These people are super easy to get along with, and they don't cause much trouble. Managers say, yep, like them, give me more of them, right? Okay. Of course, we have other performance criteria besides overall performance. We have competency ratings. Again, these are mostly supervisor ratings of performance on a variety of competencies. And so what I've done here is I'll show them by sort of positive performance indicators and negative performance indicators. For the rebels, we don't see any positive performance indicators. We see lots of negative ones. But the ones that we see are really interesting. Lacking political savvy, not modeling good behavior for others, difficulty with self-development, difficulty overcoming obstacles. Remember, this is the group that's low adjustment, high excitable. For the marketers, we only see positive performance indicators. One of my favorites is this one. Remember, the first thing I said when I saw that profile was, boy, this group is really confident. And that's exactly what their supervisors say. They're really good at displaying confidence. Check, right? But they're competitive. They're seen as really high performers by their supervisors. The proletarians actually have hardly any negative performance indicators. The only one is a little bit on handling stress, but they're seen as positive on a whole bunch of characteristics by their managers, including dealing with conflict and being friendly and caring about other people. For the congenials, it's an interesting pattern because I was surprised that sales focus was up there. But I think the ones that are really clear with them are team building and handling stress, engagement. These are the things that we would think we would see mostly out of the congenials. Good at relationship building. For overachievers, it's again all positive. In fact, I stopped. There are no negative. The list for overachievers that just goes on and on and on. There are all these positive things. Their bosses love them for all kinds of things. And networkers have a really long list as well of positive things. What's interesting is the comparison between the two. Right? So they both have driving strategy, but with networkers we see things like driving performance, industry insight, presenting to others. Some of that doesn't show up over here. Verbal communication, inspiring others, that's another one that stands out to me. Right? These are people who put forth a vision for what the company should be like or where the company should be headed. And so they get promoted up, whereas the overachievers just keep doing a good job. Misfits, no surprise that there weren't any positive performance indicators. There are a whole host of negative performance indicators. And the preppers, again, I think this distinction between these two is really interesting because their profiles aren't that different. But clearly managers see them in a different way. And again, it's that prudence, right? And look what the performance indicators are that are associated with that difference in prudence. Okay, the last bit I'll talk about concerns reputation, the last bit of validity. And so we have 360 data thanks to our friends at PVC. We have a lot of 360 data actually. We've got almost 13 raters per person. The typical person has 11 people who describe them. And so what I'm going to show you now is how these profiles are related to 360 things, right? So if you're this profile, what do other people say about you? So for rebels, they're described as competitive and driven. They're seen as having difficulty managing emotions, being calm and even-tempered, behaving to high ethical standards. Right, that sounds an awful lot like. Right, I think the picture's maybe starting to emerge here. I don't know what these people are like. Marketers, seen as competitive and driven, having passion. But it's interesting, the one negative one is about being open, straightforward, and communicating honestly, right? Again, remember this is the group that's overrepresented among salespeople. I think it's interesting. For the proletarians, treats people with respect, behaves to high ethical standards. Right? This is the Ron Swanson kind of people. For the congenials, look, we see positive attitude, manage their emotions well, they're calm and even-tempered, positive role model for others. Right? Remember, this is what your peers say about you at work. Overachievers, it's interesting, we didn't see a lot of we saw mostly the adjustment stuff that showed up when we asked peers about the overachievers. We didn't see a lot of the sort of driving business stuff that shows up in the peer ratings. And then for the networkers, we see influencing and negotiation skills, competitive and driven, assertive and energetic. Lots of the sociability stuff there. For misfits, it's interesting, that one shows up as positive, but for the most part, their work colleagues see some negative things. So they're not very positive or friendly. They don't have excellent people skills. And for preppers, we see both, again, this blend of positive and negative things. So they are ethical and consistent. We see some of that prudent stuff, right, producing high quality air-free work. but they're not seen as very passionate about what they're working on. They're not seen as assertive and energetic. Okay. Doing good. A few things I want to point out. One is that I think this is the most comprehensive investigation of person types ever conducted. And I'm not just saying that because I did it. I think if you look at the literature, this is really, we have better data than anybody else. And so that's the reason why it is. It's not because it was me, it was because of the data that we have. But I would also say that these aren't really person types. Even though I've talked about these 8, that they're really more like just common patterns that we see in personality profiles, right? Types really are like you're either this or that, and there's no overlap between them. There's clearly overlap between these. The profiles are clearly correlated with each other. We saw some of that earlier. And the other thing I would say in that regard is that, and so some people have wondered, some people have asked me when I've talked about this sort of casually before, wait, is Hogan going to types now? Is that what Hogan's doing? And no, we're not. In fact, I ran some models that I didn't present here today where you try to predict performance. You try to predict performance from the types, you try to predict performance from the traits. Well, the traits win. But that's not a surprise. We already knew that. We've known that for a really long time. So the point here isn't in terms of predicting performance to think about types, but I could see some utility, and I think I have this, for helping people interpret profiles, right? So imagine if you went to Hogan certification training, and in the back of the manual, there were 8 profiles there that looked like these, and gave you some clear interpretations, right? If you understand how to interpret what's going on with this person. And now, you're going to do a feedback session. And you've got a new flash report in front of you, and you can compare it to those and say, you know what, this one looks an awful lot like that one. Maybe I should start there. Maybe I should start with the themes that are around that profile, and that'll help me sort of give me some training wheels in terms of getting started. For those of you who've been doing interpretations for a really long time, that's probably not useful. But I think it could be really useful for somebody who's just getting started out and doing that kind of interpretation. The other thing is, it's really clear that these are consequential for all kinds of career and workplace outcomes. They're related to performance, they're related to 360 ratings, they're related to the kinds of careers and job levels that people are in. And I think from a developmental standpoint, there's some really interesting insights we can use in terms of coaching, right? When we think about how similar are the profiles to each other, that can give us really clear guidelines. If I'm working with someone who's a misfit, I might try to coach them to be more like a prepper. I'm probably never going to get a misfit to look like an overachiever, for example, right? But I can move people in slight ways through some coaching and development that might have a dramatic impact on their career. Okay, that's it for me. So I can take questions or complaints, but there's also beer on the roof. So, Carolyn.
What is the main difference between a marketer and a networker?
Yeah. So good question. So I should just go back and look at it that way.
Are those the two that people switch back to?
No, actually, the marketers and the overachievers are the closest in that regard, but I think the big one is the networkers actually don't score that high on like prudence. So whereas the marketers and both the marketers and the overachievers score pretty high on prudence, the networks are really low. The networkers are much more risk taking than the marketers.
Ryan, which profile are you? You don't have to answer that.
You can probably guess.
Should we take a poll?
Well,
Say it louder for everyone in the back here.
my closest fit was on the overachiever, which is the why I probably understand why they're so psychologically desperate.
Have you, if I understand right, you're using the global data set?
Yes.
To generate these?
Yeah, that's right.
Have you tried using this in different country-specific data sets to see if these 8 types maintain?
Yeah, obviously that's a really important question, and no, I have not. Part of the reason for that is because one of the advantages of using the global data set is the size, and that I can be really confident in the replicability because of the size. When I start to narrow it down, then we lose a substantial amount of data, and then the replicability indices go down when you do that. But I haven't really looked at closely, so that's an important thing to do if you want to talk about these as being sort of universal. Michael?
With the 360, did you only look at peer ratings, or is that all of the ratings or just peer?
It is actually all. I think I said peer, but it's actually all. So that includes supervisors, peers, I forgot what the other. Yeah, basically everybody. Yeah, everybody around you except self. I did exclude self ratings.
And you're looking at all 28 scales in relation to one another, not giving any preference to conceptually related scales that should be more similar or different.
Yeah, no, they're all treated independently in terms of the analysis.
Any idea what you think the stability of MBTI is? Is this superior?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think they really advertise that right, because it's probably not that good. But I don't know. I don't actually know. That's a good question.
To your point as well, you got what you were saying seems to be a pretty stable findings and test retest, given that there's 8 of these and stuff like that. So it's way better than chance. So
yeah,
I'd just be curious to see because they're at the same extreme.
Yeah, and of course the advantage of this versus an MBTI is right, it forces you to one side or the other, whereas this one doesn't, right? It does force you to be in one or another, but it doesn't say, okay, you're totally forced to be on that side. This is something I put up. This is all done conceptually. I don't really have any data to say that this is true, but this is just a conceptual mapping of how these might fall in terms of, say, like Holland's model, the MBTI, the DISC, or the 5-factor model. So if you're like, how does this relate to one of these other systems? This is my best guess at how they probably relate, but I don't have any data to show that that's true. Should I talk about this? One of the other things I think is really neat, and this is from Nathan. Nathan did this for us. So Nathan's redoing all of these algorithms for what we're calling re-express. It's a part of the new selection system that you've all probably heard about. And there's a certain percentage of people who don't pass any of the algorithms. Like there's like 9 or 10 job profiles, and they don't pass any of them, and they don't pass general employability. And I said, wow, what percentage of people is that? And it turns out it's about 2.7% of people who don't pass anything. And so then I said, give me those 2.7% of people, and let's look at what their profile looks like. And this is what it looks like. It says low potential, but that's really, we just put something on there. It's not really low potential. It's just, these are people who don't pass our profiles. And by the way, all of our profiles are keyed on performance, right? So these are arguably this is a sort of low performing one. What's really interesting about this one is that it fits really, the reason I included it in this talk is because it fits really, really closely with the misfits profile. So then I asked Nathan the opposite. I said, well, Nathan, that's really cool. What percentage of people pass every profile? Like every job. Admin, clerical, they pass it. Service support, they pass it. General employability, right? They pass every single, no matter what job number, they pass it. And they look like this. And this one actually is a really close fit with the overachiever profile, which I think is kind of interesting. And it's about a little over 3% of people pass every profile. So that'll be coming in the future, but not for right now. But I think it's really interesting.
When you ask Nathan, do you do like you're doing with Siri and go, hey Nathan, would you do that for me? And he just does it.
Sometimes Nathan, I think, he puts his headphones on because he doesn't want to hear me do that.
It's awesome.
One of the other things that I'll just mention briefly, because some people do ask about demographic differences on the profiles. The ages are pretty similar. The rebels are a little younger, which is kind of like, well, actually, maybe that's part of it. But then, in terms of men and women, the differences are really small. The congenials are slightly overrepresented among women. Marketers are slightly overrepresented among men, but those differences are really pretty trivial. Okay. Should we quit? All right, thanks everybody.